Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the gritty, dust-choked trails of the American Wild West, that raw, lawless era of the 1800s, where survival often depended more on how you looked and less on what you knew. Before we saddle up, make sure to like the video if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, morning, evening, or the dead of night. It's always a joy seeing how far and wide this campfire stretches. Now dim those lights, kick back, and let's begin. Welcome to the frontier, a land where soap was suspicious and a clean shirt was practically an invitation to get robbed. Out here, appearances weren't just superficial, they were survival strategies. The first rule: don't look new. If your clothes look fresh off the rack, you might as well wear a target on your chest. The moment a person stepped off the train in a pressed shirt, they weren't seen as stylish. They were seen as unseasoned, probably wealthy and ripe for the picking. Your outfit needed to tell a story, one of hardship, grime, and maybe a few fights you didn't win. Shirts weren't just garments. They were camouflage, torn sleeves, stains you couldn't explain, patches held together with hope and luck. These weren't fashion failures, they were credentials. They said, "I've been around, I know what's what. I won't be fooled or robbed without a fight." Even the smell mattered. A coat that carried the scent of stale tobacco, worn leather, and faint gunpowder was like wearing a sheriff's badge. It signaled age, experience, and maybe a tendency to bite back when provoked. That odor told others you weren't new to saloons or to gunfights. Color was another language entirely. If your clothes were brown, gray, or so dust-coated they were indistinguishable from the desert ground, you were safe. Show up in a red shirt or a bright blue vest, and not only did you scream outsider, you might earn a few jealous glares or worse, bullets from people who didn't like attention seekers. Footwear wasn't any less important. Boots were your lifeline in the West, and the more beat up they looked, the better. Scuffed leather, cracked soles, maybe a missing heel-all of that whispered, "I've been walking these lands a long time." Polished boots that meant you just stepped off a train and didn't know the difference between a cactus and a cook fire. And hatso, the hat politics of the Wild West. You needed one, no doubt, but pick the wrong kind and you'd be asking for trouble. Too tall, and people would think you were overcompensating. Too small, and you'd look like someone's lost nephew. The ideal hat was sun-faded, battered, and wide enough to keep the sun out and the stares away. Accessories, more than just decoration. A dusty bandana might keep you from choking on trail dust, but it also said you'd been out there doing real work. Tie it too neatly, and it said you cared too much about appearances, and in the Wild West, that wasn't a compliment. Throw in a rusty old knife or a dented flask, and now you're speaking the local language. Out here, everyone respected rust. A rusted spur, a corroded belt buckle, a revolver that looked like it had history, all told the tale of a person who'd been through it and come out the other side. Maybe not intact, but alive. And that counted for a lot. Facial expressions, too, were part of your wardrobe. A weary squint, a furrowed brow, a jaw that rarely smiled. Those were marks of someone who knew not to laugh too easily, who'd maybe slept in a barn or under the stars and found it tolerable. And if you looked like you mattered, like you were important, that was the worst mistake of all. In the Wild West, high-profile folks were the first to be shot, robbed, or hustled. Staying under the radar was safer than any gun. Now let's talk about words. They were currency, and like bullets, best used in small doses. Big talk got you noticed, and not in a good way. It made you a target. Nobody wanted to hear tales of glory from Missouri or exaggerated stories about mountain lion wrestling. If you boasted too loud, someone was bound to test you. And usually not with words. Confidence in the West was quiet. It was in the way you walked, not in what you said. If someone asked if you were good with a gun, the smart answer was a shrug. If they asked if you'd been in a fight, you'd say once or twice. That was the code. Never reveal too much. Let others assume, and if they guessed wrong, well, that was on them. Overconfidence didn't last long in the frontier towns. Braggers either got challenged, shot, or embarrassed in publics, sometimes all three in one night. The ones who lasted longest were the ones who said little and meant even less. And there were rules about staring. Don't do it. Don't eyeball the sheriff. Don't lock eyes with the stranger in the shadows. And absolutely Dan T. gawk at the man polishing his revolver with one hand and eating stew with the other. In the West, the only thing it was safe to stare at was your own drink. And even then, only because you wanted to make sure it wasn't crawling with something. Then there was the sacred relationship between a man and his horse. Complimenting someone's horse was a dangerous game, touching it downright suicidal. In many places, a man's horse ranked right between his gun and his family in terms of what not to mess with. Even looking at it too long was sometimes taken as a challenge or worse, an insult. Flirting with a man's horse, and yes, apparently that was a thing, was asking for a one-way ticket to Boot Hill. That animal wasn't just transportation, it was a partner, a lifeline, a symbol of a man's identity. People killed over less than a misplaced glance. Surviving the Wild West wasn't about having the most money or the fanciest gun. It was about reading the room, the saloon, and knowing when to shut up, when to walk away, and when to disappear into the dust. You didn't want to be a hero where heroes got shot. You wanted to be invisible, reliable, the kind of person no one remembered, but everyone respected. And above all else, you had to listen. Not just with your ears, but with your whole self. Listen to the way the bartender hesitated before pouring a drink. Listen to the silence that followed a stranger's entrance. Listen for footsteps behind you, whispers at the poker table, and the clink of metal that didn't belong. The West didn't care if you were smart. It cared if you were aware. If you noticed the tension in a room before it exploded. If you recognized when a smile didn't reach the eyes. That sixth sense, that unspoken understanding of danger, was more valuable than any rifle. So the next time you imagine yourself in the Wild West, don't picture yourself as the dashing cowboy with the clean hat and shiny boots. Picture yourself as the dusty stranger no one notices until it's too late. The one who blends in, knows when to speak, when to duck, and when to leave town at midnight. Because that's how you survived. By looking like you belonged, talking like you didn't care, and walking like you'd already seen too much. This was life on the edge, a place where the sunsets were beautiful, the justice was quick, and survival wasn't a right, it was a skill. And in the American Wild West, it was the quiet, dusty, underestimated ones who walked out of the saloon with their boots still on and their stories still untold. Absolutely. Below is your rewritten story. In English, fully original wording, same structure and tone as the sleepless historian style you provided, without copying a single line or phrase from the original. It starts from the same point as your transcript and follows through to the final section about sleeping in the Wild West. Neither path ends well. That's the truth of it. If you're out here trying to survive, the safest strategy is simple. Keep your head down, speak only when necessary, and if you feel like handing out compliments, make sure you're complimenting something that doesn't carry a gun. Say things like, "Sky's clear today. Beans are all right." But never, never say, "I'm pretty handy with a gun," unless you're ready to prove it while bleeding on the floor. See, the Wild West didn't smile on charm. It didn't care if you were witty, bold, or friendly. It favored the man who could enter a bar, buy a drink, and leave before anyone even remembered he'd been there. The frontier was scattered with towns. Some were thriving, full of promise and prospectors. Others were just graves with names. Picking the wrong one wasn't just bad luck. It was a good way to end up part of the furniture in someone's fireplace. Here's your first rule of survival. Never trust a town that calls itself lively. That's not a marketing phrase, that's a death sentence. Lively means duels by lunch and funerals by sundown. And if you see a town sign riddled with bullets, hanging sideways, and guarded by a vulture on a fence post, turn your horse around. That's not a warning, that's a preview. You're not looking for excitement. You're looking for a town so dusty and quiet that people forget you're even there. A place where the troublemakers are too exhausted to start anything, and too sunburned to chase you if they do. But maybe you're not cautious. Maybe you're greedy. Maybe you've heard whispers of gold and think a boomtown sounds exciting. Fine. Head into one of those fast-growing gold rush towns where the population triples by breakfast, and half of them are already armed. You might make a fortune if you survive long enough to remember where you hid it. Boomtowns were where people found riches, lost their ethics, and died loudly. Nobody asks questions. Nobody remembers names. And the only thing higher than the prices is the number of bodies piled behind the saloon. So maybe you want something stable, clean, peaceful. You look for a town where the railroad stops. Maybe there's a schoolhouse, a chapel, and a mayor with a mustache and a handshake. Sounds civilized. Until you realize the mayor's drunk, the sheriff's bleeding, and the preacher runs a poker game on Tuesday nights. There is no safe town in the Wild West. There are only towns where death takes its time. Before you put down roots, ask the questions that matter. Does the graveyard have more residents than the town? Do people greet you with smiles or silent hands moving beneath their coats? Is the general store selling canned food in coffins side by side? If the answer to any of those is yes, you're already too close. Because in the end, the perfect town isn't the one with gold or gunmen or romance. It's the one where no one asks where you came from, and more importantly, no one mistakes you for someone they were supposed to kill. Now let's talk about sleep. If you thought surviving the West meant earning a peaceful night, congratulations. You suffer from what scientists would call cranial optimism. The locals just call it stupid. Out here, sleep isn't rest, it's risk. A gamble you take because your body's demanding it, even though your brain knows better. Yes, you need to sleep. So does your horse. But your horse can kick threats in the chest while half asleep. You, on the other hand, you just snore and hope no one steals your boots. You've got 3 options, and none of them are good. Option 1, the saloon floor. Free, available, and soaked in years of regret. Every board under your back is soaked in beer, blood, spit, and broken promises. You'll share space with a drunk, a dog, and a guy who may or may not be breathing. Either way, nobody's cleaning up. Option 2. A boarding house bed. It might have a mattress, maybe a door, maybe even a lock, if you're lucky. But don't be fooled. The walls are so thin you can hear someone thinking, and the man in the next room, he might be dreaming about stabbing someone, maybe you. Every creaking floorboard is a threat. Every cough could be a prelude to a robbery. And the lady who owns the place, she hasn't smiled since her third husband vanished. Option 3. The wilderness. Fresh air, beautiful stars, coyotes, bandits, rain, spiders with ambition. You'll wake up cold, wet, bitten, and wondering if you really needed to survive today after all. So how do you sleep? You don't, not really. You lie down like a raccoon in a thunderstorm, eyes half open, knife under your hand, always facing the door. You don't relax. You don't stretch. You stay ready, because the second you turn your back to anything, you've invited it to kill you. And if something does come near, you'd better hope it's just a nosy prospector looking for a drinking buddy, because if it's not, well, you won't be waking up at all. Absolutely. Below is your new story rewritten entirely in my own words, starting from the same phrase you gave. Pro tip: the tone, structure, and humor match the sleepless historian style while staying 100% original and avoiding all copied phrases. The flow remains intact, and the information is delivered in a fresh voice. If you ever hear someone whispering your name while you're halfway between dreaming and death, don't answer. It's not your friend. It's either a ghost, your own mind breaking down, or a man trying to sell you imaginary farmland out in snake country. Instead, learn the lost art of aggressive napping. Take 10-minute snoozes behind crates. Doze for 15 while your horse meanders like it knows what it's doing. An hour inside the town jail. That's luxury, as long as the sheriff doesn't remember whether or not you actually supposed to be in there. Now, let's talk about water. The clear, shimmering lie of the West. Yes, water is essential. But out here, it's also confusing, dangerous, and often has a grudge against your digestive system. What looks like a pleasant trickle of a stream might as well be a bacteria cocktail with a splash of livestock runoff. These aren't pristine mountain springs. They're where animals drink, bandits wash blood off their boots, and prospectors bathe once a presidency. If you're dipping your tin cup straight into the current, congratulations, you've just swallowed the entire surrounding ecosystem and its regrets. You could try to boil it, assuming you have firewood, a pot, and 10 uninterrupted minutes. But let's be real, in the Wild West, asking for that kind of peace is like asking a coyote not to steal your boots. So most folks just drank what they found and hoped their guts were made of stronger stuff than the average corpse. Now, some people skipped water altogether and went straight to the local miracle cure. Whiskey. Does it hydrate? No. Does it help? Also no, but at least it burns so bad going down, you forget how thirsty you are. That's the kind of logic people lived on out here. Distract yourself until death becomes background noise. Rain, sure, in theory, it exists. But it's either a cruel drought or a surprise monsoon that wipes out your mule, your gear, and your pride, all before breakfast. Collecting rain in buckets sounds clever until you find a squirrel bathing in it. Some towns had wells, had being the important word. Wells dried up, got sabotaged during feuds, or were accidentally poisoned when someone insulted someone else's cooking. Frontier disputes were rarely over big issues. Sometimes it came down to stew. So if someone offers you clean well water, ask this: how many people drank it yesterday? And how many are still breathing today? In short, never trust water that doesn't come in a sealed bottle. And they didn't have bottles. Water out here. It's a charming liar. Looks honest, acts innocent, but will drop you in a coffin faster than a snake bite. Now on to food. The second betrayal. Eating on the frontier wasn't about pleasure. It was about survival. Barely. The basic food pyramid had 4 sides: beans, biscuits, bacon, and denial. Let's begin with beans. They were everywhere, dry, bland, and endless. Pinto, black, or mystery, boiled in a soot-covered pot over a fire that may or may not have been legal. No spices, no complaints. You eat them because you must, and then wonder if time has stopped. Biscuits. Less like bread and more like edible bricks. If they're hot, you're lucky. If not, they're weapons. Some cowboys used them as throwing stones. Others softened them with coffee until they resembled regret. Then there's bacon, the Wild West's gift to arteries everywhere. Greasy, salty, vaguely resembling meat, bacon made everything seem okay for about 5 seconds. Then you remembered this was your 29th straight meal of pork and self-pity. Somewhere inside you, your organs started unionizing. And finally, stew, the grand mystery of frontier dining. Always simmering, always questionable. Nobody asked what was in it. They just prayed it wasn't moving. If it crunched, you chewed. If it twitched, you prayed. Stew wasn't made with recipes. It was made with whatever hadn't run away yet. Absolutely. Here's your next section, fully rewritten in original wording, with the same starting point and narrative flow. Done in the tone of a historical humorist like Sleepless Historian, but using completely fresh language and no copied phrases. If it twitches, look away. If someone tells you it tastes like chicken, they're either dangerously optimistic or have never actually met a chicken. Let's talk desserts, or, as they were known in the West, myths. Sweet food wasn't part of survival, it was part of folklore. The closest most folks got to dessert was biting into a stale cracker and pretending it was cake. Maybe, you traded an old boot for a spoonful of molasses that was older than the saloon. And if you ever saw an actual pie, turn around. It was either cursed, poisoned, or baked by someone who recently got dumped by a deputy and wants revenge. Now then, coffee. What passed for coffee in the frontier wasn't tea, really a drink. It was a personality test, thick as regret, dark as a cave-in, and boiled in a metal pot that hadn't been scrubbed since the previous decade. Cowboy coffee didn't just wake you up. It threatened you. One sip, and you'd remember your name, your sins, and the exact moment you lost all feeling in your tongue. Let's talk about your horse. Your horse is not just transportation. It's your traveling companion, your bodyguard, your therapist, and, most importantly, the only creature in your life with any real sense. And no, it doesn't trust you, nor should it. You're a walking disaster who once thought cutting through a ravine at sundown was a clever shortcut. That horse, on the other hand, remembers where the last 3 riders vanished, and unlike you, it pays attention when birds stop singing or when the wind shifts direction. It's dirty, it smells like a barn on fire, but it's the most dependable partner you'll ever have. And way smarter than your cousin Carl, who thought dynamite was a candle. Horses are tuned in 2 things you'll never sense: shifts in the earth, rustling in the sagebrush, strange quiet that means something hungry is nearby. If your horse freezes, it's not broken, it's saving you. If it turns and walks away, you follow. It doesn't care about your ego, it cares about survival. If it throws you, chances are you were about to ride face first into something with teeth. Feeding the beast matters. Give it oats, maybe a carrot if you feel generous, but don't expect it to love you. This isn't a puppy. This is a 1,000-pound judgment machine that'll carry you through rain, dust, bullets, and fire, but will never nuzzle your hand unless you're holding food. And for heaven's sake, give it a real name, not Buttercup, not Marshmallow. Name it something with grit, like Grave Whisper or Jeff. Yes, Jeff. Short, honest, confusing. Something that makes people wonder if the horse is dangerous or just very tired of your choices. Care matters. Groom the horse. Clean its hooves. Talk to it. Not because it wants conversation, it docenty, but because it needs reassurance that you at least marginally competent. Trust is earned out here, and your horse has higher standards than most priests. Now, let's move on to weapons. Out in the Wild West, carrying a sidearm wasn't just about protecting yourself. It was a survival signal. Walking around unarmed was basically telling the world you were soft, confused, and ready to be robbed. Did most people know how to shoot? Of course not. Some couldn't hit a barrel with a shovel, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that you looked the part. So yes, strap on a pistol. Not a polished one, but something with a worn grip, a missing screw, maybe a name carved into the handle. If it moves, pretend you didn't see it. Anything with legs, wings, or the potential to bite is best ignored, unless it's already on your plate, and even then, proceed with suspicion. That's a fairy tale. Out here, the closest you'll get to sweets is a chunk of hardtack softened in creek water, or maybe some sticky syrup bartered for half a boot and a convincing story. Now, let's discuss coffee. Out here, it's less about taste and more about survival. The brew is pitch black, thick enough to patch a roof, and has been percolating in the same soot-crusted pot since someone fired the first musket. It'll wake you up, clear your sinuses, and possibly erase the last 3 years of your life. Your horse. That's not just an animal. It's your ride, your bodyguard, your therapist, and the only living soul that genuinely understands how dumb your plans are. And make no mistake, your horse doesn't like you. It tolerates you, barely. You, the upright disaster, who thinks wandering into a blind canyon at sundown is part of the adventure. Meanwhile, your horse remembers exactly how that went for the last 3 morons. A horse is no fool. It sees trouble before you do. Hears it, feels it, smells it. If it stops moving, that's not stubbornness. That's the universe giving you a second chance. If it turns around, let it. Don't argue. If it tosses you off, consider it divine intervention. Feed it well. Oats. Maybe a crisp apple if you're feeling generous. But don't expect gratitude. This isn't a dog. This is a 1,000-pound judgment machine that will carry you through dust storms and gunfire, but absolutely will not cuddle. And don't give it a name like Snuggleberry. Call it something grim, like Gravelspit, Widowmaker, or Jeff. Something that tells the world this horse knows pain. Groom it. Talk to it. Not because it loves conversation, but because it needs to be sure you're not a total idiot. A horse values competence. If you walked into town without some kind of iron on your hip, you might as well be wearing a sign that said, "Please rob me and maybe steal my shoes," while you re-at it. Knowing how to use it, that was optional. Half the people out here couldn't hit the side of a church from inside the bell tower. Didn't matter. The trick was to look like the kind of person who might pull the trigger, or at the very least, the kind who'd die trying. Pistols were the go-to, not the polished, pretty kind. Missing half a grip, something that looks like it'd been through 4 gunfights and 1 existential crisis. That kind of weapon said, "I've made mistakes, and I'll make more if you push me." You didn't just carry a gun. You wore it. It was fashion. It was a warning. It was your resume. If you couldn't shoot straight, fine. Just make sure your face says, "I'm about 1 insult away from making a bad decision." Knives, also essential. Not just for self-defense, but for eating, carving, digging, and on one unforgettable occasion, performing a dental extraction under the stars. A decent blade out here was worth more than a gold tooth and twice as personal. People in the Wild West didn't fear death. They feared dying stupid. You never knew when trouble would find you. A dispute over poker, a bad joke told to the wrong man, or the fact that you walked into a saloon and ordered tea. If it kept the sun off your back and the dust out of your lungs, it was good enough. If it didn't smell like death after 3 wears, it was probably stolen. Hats weren't optional. They were portable roofs, wide-brimmed, sweat-stained, often shaped like they lost a bar fight. Your hat told people who you were and how many times you'd been hit in the head. Lose your hat in the Wild West, and you might as well dig your own shallow grave. Bandanas, not just for show. They were filters, sweat rags, tourniquets, and occasionally blindfolds, depending on the situation and how badly your week was going. That 1 square of cloth was the only thing between you and a lungful of regret. Boots, heavy, ugly, built to survive both deserts and bad decisions. You didn't wear boots for comfort. You wore them because snake bites, scorpion stings, and stepping on the wrong end of a nail were all daily possibilities. Bonus points if they squeaked like a haunted door or left a trail of mystery in the mud. Layers mattered. You'd wake up freezing, sweat through noon, and go to bed wrapped in every piece of clothing you owned. Coats were usually patched, coats inside of coats, like survival Russian dolls. And if you had a jacket that didn't smell like horses, fire, smoke, and your worst mistake, you were either very new or very dead. Shelter out here wasn't architecture. It was luck nailed together. If you found 4 walls and a roof that didn't leak or creak like it had secrets, you were either dreaming or squatting in someone else's cabin. And if that someone came back, you'd better have coffee, an explanation, and 0 sudden movements. Most nights, you didn't even get that luxury. Your bed was the ground, your mattress a collection of regrets and rocks, and your blanket whatever hadn't blown away in the wind. If you were lucky, you had a bedroll, which was really just a fancy term for a dirty piece of canvas that smells like old campfire and horse sweat. Tents. Only if you were traveling in style or with the army. Otherwise, it was trees, caves, or under the stars, which were beautiful until it rained sideways or a raccoon stole your last biscuit. And let's be honest, the stars lose their charm when your back's soaked, your socks are frozen, and something howled twice as close as it did 5 minutes ago. Sleep wasn't rest, it was a tactical decision. 10 minutes here, maybe an hour behind a barrel. Half a nap in the saddle while your horse kindly ignored the fact that you were snoring into its mane. Jew. Didn't sleep because you were tired. You slept because your body decided it had no other option. Privacy never met her. If you weren't bunking in a saloon attic, sharing space with two gamblers and a man named Snakebite Pete, then you were curled up behind a tumbleweed, praying no one mistook you for a lump worth robbing. Medical care in the Wild West was half bravery, half superstition, and the other half whiskey. If you got shot, stepped on a nail, or sneezed suspiciously, there were two options: ride it out, or pray someone nearby had experience pretending to be a doctor. Credentials were optional. Most frontier doctors had never seen a real medical school, but they had definitely seen a man bleed out and figured, can't be that hard. The tools: rusty knives, thread, whiskey, maybe a saw if your problem was considered removable. Anesthesia was either a good punch to the face or a generous helping of something strong enough to burn a hole through your memories. Stitches were uneven, scars were trophies, and if you walked away alive, you were considered cured. Cures came in bottles, tins, and tall tales: snake oil, miracle salves, tonics with names like Dr. Elwood's elixir of eternal energy, which was 90% alcohol, 10% root bark, and 100% false hope. If it didn't fix you, at least it made you forget what needed fixing. Dentistry. That's hilarious. Teeth were dealt with like bad poker hands, pulled quickly and with minimal ceremony, usually with a tool meant for something else entirely. The local barber, blacksmith, or that one guy who claimed he knew a little about Jaws was your best bet. Numbness came from liquor, and infection came right after. And heaven help you if someone suggested leeches, because yes, they used leeches. Or poultices made of herbs, dirt, and whatever a traveling healer could scrape off a canyon wall. If you were lucky, it just smelled bad. If you weren't, it came with hallucinations and maybe a conversation with the afterlife. Out here, silence was louder than gunfire. You could ride for days without seeing another soul, and when you finally did, you weren't sure if you should wave or reach for your pistol. Most cowboys didn't talk much, not because they didn't have anything to say, but because they forgot what a real conversation felt like. Loneliness wasn't just an emotion, it was part of the landscape. It crept into your boots, it settled in your bones, and it stared at you from the dark every time you set up camp alone. The wind became your only companion, and even it sounded like it was whispering things better left unheard. You made friends where you could: your horse, your shadow, maybe a dog that followed you for scraps. If you were lucky, you met someone on the trail who didn't want to rob you. And if you were really lucky, they stayed for a second cup of coffee before riding off into the dust. Towns were small, but the spaces between people were big. You could sit in a saloon full of drunks, gamblers, and wandering preachers and still feel like you were the only human left on earth. Folks were friendly enough, but nobody got too close. Out here, people had a habit of disappearing, shot, sick, or just wandered off into the hills one day and never came back. Letters took months, if they arrived at all. You could be dead and buried before your mama even knew you caught a fever. Romance was rare, marriage rarer, and the idea of settling down was something most just said out loud when they wanted to sound braver than they felt. In the Wild West, you didn't fear being alone. You expected it, and you carried that weight like your saddle, worn, weathered, and part of the ride. Forget the movies. Gunfights in the Wild West Warren, dramatic duels at high noon with music swelling in the background. They were messy, panicked, and over in seconds. If you were lucky. If you weren't, they dragged on just long enough for everyone involved to regret their life choices. Most shootouts weren't planned. They started with a spilled drink, a bad card hand, or someone breathing too loud near the wrong man's horse. Suddenly, pistols were drawn, bullets flew, and bystanders hit the floor faster than you could yell, "Hold on." The winner was NT, the fastest draw. It was usually the drunk with the steadiest hand, or the least to lose. Accuracy, optional. Most folks couldn't hit the side of a barn unless they were inside it. Guns were old, dirty, and prone to misfiring, and nerves didn't help. You fired, hoped, and prayed, sometimes all at once. There were no warning shots, unless you counted the shouting. And when it was over, there were no lawyers, maybe a sheriff, if the town had one sober enough to care. Bodies were dragged off, stories got swapped, and the loser was blamed for starting it, whether he did or not. Justice moved slow, if at all. Bullets moved faster. Carrying a gun wasn't about protection. It was a performance, a statement. It said, "I'm not afraid to die, but I'd prefer it be you instead." Some folks wore their pistols like jewelry, showing off ivory handles and shiny barrels. Others just stuffed them in belts and prayed they didn't fire on their own. The truth. Most men who died in gunfights never saw it coming. They weren't outlaws or legends. They were tired ranch hands, unlucky gamblers, or someone who made the mistake of calling the wrong man a cheat. Then let's ride straight into the illusion of law and order, where sheriffs wore stars, but justice wore a blindfold and carried a shovel. Out here, the law wore spurs. A sheriff might have a badge, but that didn't mean he had a plan, or a moral compass, or even shoes that matched. Sometimes he was the only man in town willing to stand up to trouble. Other times, he was the trouble, just better dressed and slightly more sober. Being a sheriff was less about law and more about balance. You kept the peace, sure, but mostly by knowing which fights not to break up. You didn't arrest the man who owned half the cattle in town, even if he shot your cousin. You arrested the drifter who looked guilty enough and didn't have a cousin to argue back. Jails were more suggestion than security. One cell, maybe two, a rusted lock, and a cot that smelled like the last 6 prisoners combined. If you got thrown in, chances are you were either drunk, unlucky, or just someone the sheriff didn't want to deal with until tomorrow. Trials, if there was one, it was quick. Judge, jury, and executioner were often the same person. Sometimes the bartender who just wanted everyone to calm down. Evidence was optional. Eyewitnesses were unreliable, and the truth usually buried with the victim. Outlaws were common. Heroes weren't. For every story of a noble gunman standing up to evil, there were a dozen where someone robbed a bank, shot 3 people, and disappeared into the hills with a stolen horse and a grin. Sometimes they came back rich, sometimes just bones. Vigilantes filled the gaps. When the law failed, mobs stepped in, torches, ropes, and judgment handed out quicker than sunrise. They called it justice. It felt more like revenge, but no one argued, not out loud, at least. So what did justice really mean in the Wild West? It meant whoever had more bullets, more friends, or a better story. And if you had all 3, you were the law. For now, then hang on tight, because now we ride into the one enemy no gunslinger ever beat. The weather, cold, cruel, and wildly personal. The West didn't care if you were tough. It cared if you were prepared. And most folks weren't. One moment, it's sun and dust. The next, a blizzard that feels like God flipping the table on your campsite. If you didn't freeze to death, you probably wished you had, just to stop hearing the wind scream like a ghost with nothing left to haunt. Summer wasn't kinder. The sun baked the land like bread no one wanted. Water vanished, rivers dried into cracked promises. Your boots stuck to the earth like they were begging you not to move. And when the rain did come, it didn't sprinkle, it attacked. Flash floods didn't knock, they kicked down the door and stole your mule. Tornadoes, they didn't announce themselves. They just spun out of nowhere, snatched barns off the ground, and rearranged your life like a toddler flipping a checkerboard. If you lived through one, you didn't talk about it. You nodded at the sky like, fair enough, and rebuilt your shack with whatever hadn't been flung into Kansas. And the wind was always there, whispering through the cracks, howling through the canyons, rattling your windows just enough to make you question your choices. It carried dust, voices, and sometimes warnings you didn't hear until it was too late. Clothing wasn't fashion, it was armor. A hat wasn't style, it was shade. A coat wasn't comfort, it was survival. And boots, they were the only thing between you and the kind of blisters that wrote memoirs. You didn't dress to look good. You dressed to not die. You learned to read the sky. Pink in the morning meant you might make it to supper. Green meant hide underground and pray. Gray could mean anything, a calm day or a funeral in slow motion. The land was wild, the sky was wilder, and every step forward felt like a dare. You didn't beat nature, you bargained with it, and hoped it was in a forgiving mood. Then let Esk stir the coals and settle in, because now we wander into the world of legends, lies, and long shadows. The stories folks wanted to believe, even when they knew better. In the Wild West, a good story traveled faster than a fast horse. Didn't matter if it was true, just that it was told well. A quiet man with a dusty hat could walk into a saloon, shoot the floor once, and 3 towns over he'd already wrestled a bear, robbed a train, and kissed a mayor's daughter, in that order. Heroes were built out of silence and suggestion. Nobody trusted a man who bragged about being dangerous. The real killers never said much, just stared too long, walked too slow, and made other men nervous without trying. That's how you earned a legend, not by being loud, but by letting other people do the talking for you. Ghost towns weren't always empty. Sometimes they whispered. Stories of gold buried beneath floorboards, of a gambler who cheated the devil and vanished before dawn, of a woman in white still seen walking the road, looking for the family she buried during a fever. You might not believe it, but you'd still ride around those towns, just in case. Then there were the gunmen with too many names, Jesse, Doc, Butch, names spoken like prayers or warnings, depending who you asked. Some of them were real. Others were stitched together from 10 different lives, each tale more impossible than the last. Shot 7 times, still breathing, killed a cougar with a fork, robbed a bank on horseback twice in the same hour. But for every legend, there were a dozen forgotten cowboys who died in the dust with no last words. Women who ran ranches and raised families without needing a song written about them. Black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, Chinese rail workers, real people who built the West only to be edited out of the picture. Even the lies had jobs. They gave people hope, or fear, or a reason to keep moving. If you were starving, freezing, and down to your last match, a story about hidden gold or a lucky stranger might be the only thing that kept your boots moving forward. Truth in the Wild West. It was as rare as rain and just as slippery. But stories lived forever, even if nobody knew who the first liar was. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE in the grand city of Alexandria. Alexandria, the dream of Alexander the Great, where marble met desert and books outnumbered soldiers. Cleopatra, the seventh Philopater, entered a world on the brink. Her dynasty, the Ptolemies, were Greek rulers who had held Egypt for nearly 300 years, but now teetered between decay and dependency on Rome's growing shadow. Still, in the palace's echoing halls, Cleopatra grew not in fear, but in preparation. From the time she could walk, she was trained as a ruler. She read Homer in the morning and studied military dispatches by night. She learned rhetoric, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and crucially languages. She mastered at least 9, including Egyptian, the language her own ancestors had ignored. Her voice, it was said, could wrap around a listener like silk. Her presence filled a room before she even spoke. She was not raised to be loved. She was raised to endure. Her father, Ptolemy, the 12th Olitz, was weak and unpopular puppet king propped up by Roman gold. When he died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra, at just 18, was crowned co-ruler beside her younger brother, Ptolemy the 13th, officially. They were husband and wife, such was the twisted tradition of the Ptolemies, but Cleopatra intended to govern alone. She had no time for court games. She lowered taxes, spoke directly with the priests of the Nile temples, and made herself visible to the common people. She minted coins, not with both their faces, but hers alone. Her brother's advisors saw her ambition as rebellion. By 48 BCE, a coup had exiled Cleopatra from the palace. She fled into the Syrian desert, but did not disappear. She began to raise an army. That same year, civil war in Rome spilled into Egypt. Julius Caesar, in pursuit of his rival Pompey the Great, arrived at Alexandria's harbor. But Pompey was already dead, murdered by Cleopatra's brother in an attempt to curry Caesar's favor. Instead, the Roman general was horrified. He demanded order in Alexandria. Cleopatra saw her chance, smuggled into the royal palace under the cover of night, possibly rolled inside a carpet or sack. Cleopatra emerged before Caesar like a vision. Sand clung to her hair. Her eyes met his without fear. This was no ordinary queen. She was the embodiment of power wrapped in myth. Caesar, already in his 50s, found himself bewitched. Their partnership was immediate and strategic. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra returned to power. Civil war erupted across Alexandria. The palace burned. The Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest in the ancient world, was partially destroyed in the chaos. Ptolemy the 13th drowned trying to flee the city. His body was found washed up by the Nile, gold armor glinting under the reeds. Cleopatra took the throne once more, this time with another younger brother, Ptolemy the 14th, as ceremonial co-ruler, but she held the reins. Not long after, she gave birth to Caesar's child, Ptolemy Caesar, known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. She declared him heir not only to Egypt, but possibly to Rome itself. The implication was dangerous. Caesar was already married. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra sailed to Rome with Caesarion. She lived in Caesar's suburban villa, a queen among republicans, and scandal among senators. Draped in gold, speaking foreign tongues, she walked with the confidence of a goddess. Caesar had a statue of her erected in the temple of Venus Genetrix. It was both admiration and provocation. Then came the Ides of March. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was stabbed to death by conspirators in the Senate. Cleopatra fled Rome at once, her dreams with Caesar shattered, but she did not return defeated. She returned to Egypt more determined than ever. Within a year, her brother and co-ruler mysteriously died, poisoned. Many suspected. Cleopatra named her son Caesarion as co-king. She alone wielded power. Rome, meanwhile, fell into chaos. Two powerful men emerged from the ruins: Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Mark Antony, his loyal general. While Octavian consolidated power in the West, Antony turned to the East and summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. She did not arrive humbly. Her barge, draped in purple sails and silver oars, floated up the Cydnus River like a vision from legend. Cleopatra sat beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Isis, goddess of motherhood and magic. Incense perfumed the air. Musicians played as she drifted to shore. Antonia, man of appetite, strength, and ego, was captivated. Their affair began that night, but it was not mere lust. It was alliance. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman power to protect her throne. Together, they returned to Alexandria, where for a time they lived as gods. They hunted, feasted, and ruled as though the world was theirs. But their union drew the wrath of Rome. Octavian painted Cleopatra as a foreign, seductress, bewitching, a once-proud Roman hero. In 40 BCE, Antony returned briefly to Rome and married Octavian's sister, Octavia, to preserve peace. But it was a hollow marriage. His heart remained in Alexandria. Cleopatra bore him 3 children. As tensions with Octavian grew, Antony returned to Haran together. They declared Caesarion as Caesar's rightful heir. They divided the eastern provinces, granting territories to their children. Cleopatra was crowned Queen of Kings. Octavian responded with war. In 31 BCE, the Roman and Egyptian fleets met at the Battle of Actium. Cleopatra commanded her own ships beside Antony, but the battle turned. Whether by panic or strategy, Cleopatra's fleet broke and fled. Antony followed. The battle was lost. Their fate was sealed. They returned to Alexandria, knowing Rome would come. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony, defeated, fell on his own sword. As he lay dying, he was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself in mourning. He died in her arms, bleeding and broken. Cleopatra, left alone, now faced the ultimate choice: humiliation or death. Octavian entered Alexandria. He intended to parade Cleopatra through Rome in chains. She smiled, dined with him, and asked for her children's future. He promised little. She knew the truth. Shortly after, in her royal chamber, draped with gold and sorrow, Cleopatra prepared for her end. She dressed in ceremonial robes. Some say she took poison hidden in a fig. Others claim she used an aspa, venomous Egyptian cobra smuggled inside a basket of fruit. Whatever the method, she died as she lived, on her terms. She was 39 years old. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt became a Roman province. Caesarion was captured and executed. Her children by Antony vanished into the machinery of empire. But her story, her mythology, grew. For 2,000 years, poets and painters, queens and conquerors, have tried to claim her, to reduce her to beauty, to elevate her to divinity. But the truth of Cleopatra is this: she was born in a dying world and held it together by force of will. She loved, ruled, lost, and rose again. It could not silence her name, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the eternal queen. To understand marriage in ancient Rome, you must first understand that it was less a bond of affection and more a matter of politics, property, and public image. For the Roman elite, especially, marriage was a contract, a union arranged not for romance, but for family, honor, and legacy. A Roman girl, often no more than 13 or 14, would be offered in marriage by her father to a man far older, chosen for his social standing, wealth, or political alliances. These weren't love stories, they were dynastic deals, and yet, even in this calculated world, beauty still lived in ritual. On her wedding day, a Roman bride wore a tunica recta, a white woolen dress tied with a special knot, the nodus herculaneus symbolizing protection and fertility. Her hair was parted with a ceremonial spear and braided into 6 plaits, crowned with flowers. An orange veil, the flammeum, was placed over her head, the color of fire, the symbol of the hearth. She stood not just as a woman, but as the spirit of the household to come. The wedding ceremony unfolded at the bride's home. Families gathered, offerings were made to the household gods, and sacred words were spoken. The bride would say, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia," where you are Gaius, I am Gaia, a traditional phrase meaning, I now belong to you. Afterward came music, a feast, and the mock ritual of abduction. The groom would pretend to take her by force from her father's arms, an echo of Rome's ancient myths. That night, torches lit her way to a new home. Bread and salt welcomed her, and with that, her married life began. But Roman marriage came in 2 main legal forms, each shaping a woman's life in radically different ways. The first was cum manu, with hand. In this model, the wife passed into the legal power of her husband. She became part of his family, lost her inheritance rights from her birth family, and, in legal terms, became almost like his adopted daughter. The husband had full control over her property, her life, and even her fate. But by the late Republic, cum manu marriages faded. A new model rose, sine manu, without hand. In these marriages, the wife remained under her father's authority, even after moving in with her husband. If her father died, she became sui juris independent in the eyes of the law. She could own land, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce. In a society where women could not vote or hold office, the sine manu marriage gave Roman women surprising behind-the-scenes power. It allowed aristocratic women to build wealth, navigate politics, and sometimes even control the fate of their husbands. Marriage, however, was not only lit, was lived. And between the legal contracts and family strategies, real human connection sometimes bloomed. Evidence from tombstones and letters shows that love did exist in Rome. A man might leave a carving saying, "To my dearest wife, who lived with me for 40 years, without a quarrel." Or a letter might read, "My heart is not in my chest without you." Daily life between a Roman husband and wife involved managing a household, raising children, organizing meals, overseeing slaves, and participating in religious rituals together. Men worked in politics, business, or war. Women managed the internal engine of Roman life, quiet, steady, and essential. It's also fragile, and Rome made no effort to pretend otherwise. Divorce in ancient Rome was shockingly simplest, especially among the upper class. There was no trial, no judge, no public disgrace. If a husband or wife wished to separate, they simply did. The wife returned her keys and dowry. The marriage ended. No reason was required. A woman could say to her husband, "I am leaving," and be gone by nightfall. She'd return to her father's house, or, if she was independent, to her own villa. This wasn't scandalous, it was routine. In fact, by the end of the Republic, divorce was common. Politicians like Cicero and Caesar went through multiple wives, often for reasons of power rather than passion. Sometimes, husbands divorced their wives over rumors alone. Julius Caesar famously divorced Pompeii after a scandal at a religious festival. Though she may have done nothing wrong, Caesar declared, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Even so, Roman women especially those in sin, Manu marriages, wielded the power to end their marriages too. They could reclaim their dowries and walk away. In one surviving inscription, a woman named Glyconia officially declared her divorce and wrote that she had taken back her full dowry. It was clean, legal, and final. Dowries played a critical role. When a woman married, her family gave a sum of money, land, or property to the husband. This was not a gift, it was support for the household. If the marriage ended, the dowry was expected to be returned unless the wife was at fault. This financial mechanism made some divorces contentious. A man who had enriched himself with his wife's wealth might resist giving it back. Roman lawyers thrived in such disputes. And what of children? Roman law stated clearly, children belonged to the father. If a marriage ended, the mother might be left without legal claim to her own children. There are quiet echoes of this sorrow in Roman poetry, where mothers speak of sons they no longer see. Still, remarriage was common. A divorced Roman woman might marry again within months, sometimes for love, often for security. In elite circles, a woman might marry 3 or 4 times in her lifetime. Widows, too often, remarried quickly. The Roman world had no patience for prolonged mourning or solitude. Life moved swiftly, and alliances were always in motion. The upper-class woman, often dismissed by historians, quietly shaped Rome's destiny through these marriages. She was the invisible architect of generations, forming alliances, bearing children, passing on property. And while Roman men stood on podiums and battlefields, Roman women steered dynasties from drawing rooms and dinner parties. Marriage in ancient Rome was never a simple love story. It was a mechanism, a system, a set of expectations. Yet, within that system, real stories lived. Stories of young brides whispering vows under orange veils, of couples growing old in shaded gardens, of women who walked away from loveless homes and took their fortunes with them, of letters, inscriptions, rumors, reconciliations, of bonds made and broken, not with shouting, but with signatures and witnesses. The Romans gave us roads and laws and aqueducts, but they also gave us this quiet truth. Marriage, for all its ritual and law, was always at its heart human, and that never changes.